They took DNA samples from Jews in New York, Jews in Morocco, Jews in Ethiopia, Jews in Iraq, communities that hadn't shared the same geography for 2,000 years. Then they compared those samples to modern Arabs, Iranians, Turks, Kurds, Druze, Palestinians, and what they found didn't just answer a historical question. It shattered one of the most persistent myths in modern history. Population genetics is one of those fields that sounds dry until you realize it's essentially a time machine. Your DNA doesn't forget where it's been. It carries traces of migrations, conquests, marriages, and separations going back tens of thousands of years. Every population on Earth has a genetic signature, a fingerprint built from thousands of years of who they lived with, who they had children with, and who they didn't. And Jewish populations, scattered across dozens of countries for nearly 2 millennia, were one of the most fascinating puzzles this science had ever tried to solve. Before we get into what the studies found, let's understand why this question even matters scientifically. When a group lives in isolation or near isolation for a long time, their genetic profile stays relatively stable. But when groups mix, that signature blurs. So the question geneticists were asking wasn't political, it was purely biological. Do Jewish communities around the world share a common genetic ancestry? And if so, where does that ancestry point? The first serious attempt to answer this with modern tools came in 2010. A team of researchers published a landmark study in the journal Nature, led by geneticists from New York University and several international institutions. They analyzed the genomes of more than 3,000 people from Jewish communities and dozens of non-Jewish Middle Eastern and European populations. The results were striking. Jewish populations Ashkenazi from Eastern Europe, Sephardi from Spain and North Africa, Mizrahi from Iraq and Iran, all clustered genetically closer to each other than to the non-Jewish populations they had lived among for generations. An Ashkenazi Jew from Poland and a Yemenite Jew from Sana'a are genetically more similar to each other than either is to their non-Jewish Polish or Yemenite neighbors. Let that sink in. Two communities separated by geography, language, culture, and centuries of history, still carrying a shared genetic thread. But here's where it gets even more interesting. When the researchers plotted Jewish populations on a genetic map alongside all their Middle Eastern and European neighbors, every single major Jewish group clustered closest to populations from the Levant, the geographic region that includes modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Not Eastern Europe, not North Africa. The Levant, the same small strip of land that sits at the center of 3 continents and has been inhabited continuously for tens of thousands of years. The closest non-Jewish genetic relatives of Ashkenazi Jews turned out to be the Druze, the Lebanese, and modern-day Palestinians, not Poles, not Germans, not Russians. The people living today in the region where, according to ancient historical records, the Jewish people originated. The genetic distance between an Ashkenazi Jew and a Lebanese Christian is smaller than the genetic distance between that same Ashkenazi Jew and most European populations. Now, this ran directly into one of the most popular counter-narratives of the 20th century, the Khazar hypothesis. The theory, promoted at various points by various writers and later picked up by political actors with very specific agendas, claimed that Ashkenazi Jews weren't descended from ancient Israelites at all, but from a medieval Turkic people called the Khazars, who supposedly converted to Judaism en masse somewhere around the 8th century in the region of modern-day Kazakhstan and southern Russia. The implication of this theory, and the reason it got so much political traction, was that European Jews had no ancestral connection to the Middle East and therefore no historical claim to that land. The genetics don't support it. Not even close. If the Khazar hypothesis were true, Ashkenazi Jews should cluster genetically with populations from the Caucasus region, Anatolia, or Central Asia. Instead, they cluster with Levantine populations. Multiple independent studies, using different methodologies, have arrived at the same conclusion. The Khazar hypothesis, whatever its political appeal, doesn't survive contact with the data. Harry Oster, the geneticist at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, who led much of this research, and later wrote a book called Legacy, A Genetic History of the Jewish People, summarized it bluntly. He said that regardless of where Jews ended up living, their DNA consistently points back to a founding population in the ancient Middle East. The diaspora preserved the genetics, even when it scattered the people. But how? How does a population maintain genetic cohesion for 2,000 years while scattered across dozens of countries on multiple continents? The answer involves several factors working together. First, endogamy, the practice of marrying within the community. Jewish communities throughout history, whether by religious law, social pressure, or exclusion from surrounding populations, married predominantly within their own group. This slowed the genetic mixing that would normally occur when a population relocates. Second, community identity. Jews maintained community structures, synagogues, shared law, shared calendar, shared texts that kept them socially distinct even when they were legally integrated. Third, population bottlenecks. Jewish communities were repeatedly decimated by persecution, which paradoxically intensified their genetic distinctiveness by reducing diversity in the surviving population. The Ashkenazi population, for instance, shows clear signs of having descended from a relatively small founding group sometime in the medieval period, with the entire modern Ashkenazi population of roughly 10 million people likely descending from a founding group of perhaps 10 to 20,000 individuals. This bottleneck effect explains something that has puzzled doctors for decades: the elevated rates of certain genetic diseases in Ashkenazi Jews, including Tay-Sachs, Gaucher disease, and BRCA mutations. These aren't signs of weakness, they're the mathematical consequence of a small founding population. When you descend from a limited gene pool, certain rare variants get amplified across the entire population simply by statistical chance. The same phenomenon shows up in other historically isolated populations: the Finns, the Amish, the Icelanders. A 2012 study pushed the analysis further. Researchers compared Jewish DNA not just to modern Middle Eastern populations, but to ancient DNA samples from archaeological sites in the Levant. The comparison showed that Jewish populations today carry a genetic profile consistent with descent from the population that inhabited that region in the ancient period. The genetic link isn't just to the modern Levant, it goes back to the ancient Levant. Now, this doesn't mean Jewish populations are genetically pure in some simplistic sense. That concept doesn't really exist in population genetics. Every population mixes. The question is how much, with whom, and over what time frame. And the data on Jewish populations shows exactly what you'd expect from a group that started in one place, scattered across the world, maintained strong endogamy, but not absolute endogamy, and experienced varying degrees of local admixture depending on where they landed. Ashkenazi Jews, for example, show roughly 40 to 50% European ancestry mixed with their Middle Eastern core, consistent with centuries of living in Europe, some intermarriage and conversion, and the social dynamics of medieval European Jewish communities. Sephardi Jews show a Mediterranean admixture pattern. Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel community, have a smaller, but still detectable Middle Eastern component, alongside substantial East African ancestry. Yemenite Jews show almost entirely Middle Eastern ancestry, with very little mixing from outside the region. What's remarkable is that despite these local variations, all of these communities still cluster more closely with each other than with their non-Jewish neighbors. The local admixture happened at the edges. The core held. A separate study published in 2013 examined the genetics of Jewish priests, the Kohanim, a group that claims patrilineal descent from Aaron, the biblical high priest. The Y chromosome, which passes almost unchanged from father to son, showed that a significant proportion of men from Jewish communities who identified as Kohanim shared a common Y chromosome signature, suggesting a real patrilineal founding ancestor. The signature was labeled the Cohen modal haplotype. It appears in roughly 40% of Ashkenazi Kohanim and 30% of Sephardi Kohanim, compared to less than 10% in non-priestly Jewish men. When you calculate backward based on mutation rates, The common ancestor carrying this Y chromosome likely lived somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, squarely within the historical time frame of ancient Israel. This is the part that keeps coming up in these studies and that keeps surprising people who approach the topic with purely modern assumptions. The genetic evidence isn't just consistent with the historical narrative in broad strokes. In specific, testable ways, the Y chromosome of the priests, the clustering with Levantine populations, the shared ancestry across wildly different diaspora communities, it keeps pointing in the same direction. David Reich, one of the world's leading population geneticists at Harvard Medical School, addressed the broader implications of this kind of research in his book, Who We Are and How We Got Here. He made a point that applies directly here. Ancient DNA and modern population genetics are generating a picture of human history that frequently confirms, complicates, and sometimes overturns what historians thought they knew. The Jewish case is one where the genetic and historical records are unusually consistent with each other. A people who, by historical accounts, originated in the ancient Levant, were dispersed across the world, maintained a distinct communal identity, and eventually returned to their original homeland, turns out to have a genetic profile that matches that narrative with remarkable precision. None of this resolves the political disputes of the modern world. Population genetics doesn't adjudicate land claims or international law or the rights of people living in a place today. That's not what the science does, and it's not what these researchers were trying to establish. But it does speak to a factual historical question that has been muddied by politics for a very long time. And the answer the data gives is clear. What's also striking is what this tells us about human identity more broadly. Jewish communities maintained a coherent genetic signature across 2,000 years of diaspora through expulsions, pogroms, forced conversions, the Holocaust, and the complete disruption of communities that had existed for centuries. Meanwhile, they absorbed influences from dozens of surrounding cultures, spoke dozens of different languages, developed different customs, and in some cases looked so different from each other that you'd never guess they shared a common ancestry. Genetics held what geography couldn't. That's actually a profound finding about what makes a population, not just geography, not just language, not just culture. There's something in the biological inheritance, passed down through generations, that preserves connections across time and space in ways that can be measured and verified. One last detail worth mentioning. The studies consistently found that the non-Jewish Middle Eastern populations, most genetically similar to Jewish populations, were not those you might expect based on political groupings today. The Druze and Lebanese populations communities that have lived in the Levant with relatively little outside mixing for thousands of years consistently emerged as the closest non-Jewish genetic relatives of Jewish populations worldwide. That makes historical and geographical sense. Before the various migrations and invasions of the last 2,000 years, all of these communities likely shared a common ancestral pool in the ancient Levant. The Jewish populations preserved that ancestry through endogamy. The Druze preserved it through their own historic isolation. The Lebanese preserved a substantial portion of it despite more mixing with later arriving populations. The science tells a story of connection across enormous distances of time, a founding population in a specific, identifiable place, a dispersal across the world. A preservation imperfect, mixed at the edges, but real of a common biological inheritance. And a clustering, in every genetic study done with sufficient precision, back toward that original point of origin. 2,000 years is a long time. Long enough for languages to die and new ones to be born. Long enough for empires to rise and fall. Long enough for almost every continuity of human civilization to be broken and rebuilt beyond recognition, but not long enough, apparently, to erase what the DNA remembers. If this kind of deep dive into where we actually come from is the kind of content you want more of, leave a comment below with a population or historical mystery you think deserves this treatment. There are dozens more stories like this one buried in the genetic record, and I plan to dig into every one of them. Hit subscribe if you don't want to miss those. And if this video made you think differently about something, even just one thing, that's what the like button is for.